Hello and welcome to another episode of Eye on Baltimore. I'm John Carrington, and sometimes when you watch Baltimore, you can't watch the present. You have to go back to the past. And I remember as a child growing up in South Baltimore watching the infancy days of television and seeing shows like The Port That Built the City, Arthur Watson and those crazy animals from the Baltimore Zoo.
And Arthur Watson really had the crazy animals.
Yes, he did.
I remember the monkey that made paintings with his tail.
And there were so many great shows on, but the one I really remember the most is Helen, Delich, Bentley and her Port That Built the City. And I was just fascinated with all the things that were going on at the waterfront in Baltimore. And it's my pleasure to finally capture Helen Delich Bentley, who is the wonderful, wonderful producer, writer, host, advertising person, the creator of the Port That
I
Built
was a jack of all trades on that show.
Mm-hmm.
I really produced it and sold it and that for 15 years. And you know, John, it was really an education, total education for me, in an entirely different field than what I was doing, just covering the waterfront for the Baltimore Sun. Here I was getting into factories. We had a myriad of I did over 800 documentaries of industries throughout the state of Maryland that were tied into the port. Did we know about them before? No, but we sure learned.
Mm-hmm. And now our whole city tourism industry is built around that inner harbor.
Inner harbor is it for tourism, you're right. Mm-hmm. And our real shipping, the overseas shipping, is down at the other end of the harbor.
Mm-hmm. And a lot of that shipping business helps to fund the engine that makes Baltimore and Maryland vital to our nation.
It's an economic engine. I always say that. Mm-hmm. And it always has been an economic engine. From the time that the first port of entry became an official port of entry in 1706. We even had shipping and some before that. But the official port of entry was established in 1706 when Humphreys Creek, which is down where Sparrows Point is today, and the point, I forget the point that where Locust Point is today, mm-hmm. but the two of them were melded together. They were merged. That was almost 24 years before Baltimore became a city. Mm. That's why I had the name, the Port That Built a City.
And there were tiny little ports along the way. I remember Port Covington, which is near Westport.
That was a segment of the port.
Okay. And then, of course,
Locust
Point.
Sparrows Point.
Okay.
The Canton area.
Right.
And the Canton area was named by a steamship captain who used to sail between Baltimore and China.
Ah.
And he sailed into Canton, China. Mm-hmm. And so he named that part of the port, mm-hmm. of the harbor, or whatever you want to call it, as Canton.
Oh, my goodness. And, of course, in Western Maryland, we produce coal.
And the coal is exported. Much of it is exported.
That came down to the harbor.
Comes down and goes out.
Oh, my.
And today, with all the changes in pollution and that in the air, right now, exports of coal are going down.
And that hurts jobs in West Virginia.
Hurts jobs everywhere.
Oh, my goodness. What do you predict for the future?
What future are you talking about?
I'm talking about the port. We're losing our ability to ship coal out.
Well, I think the ports of the whole U.S. are going to survive. They're going to be a little different. There's a thing coming on now that's called 3D shipping.
So you've seen all this development in Baltimore and in Maryland. What have you learned that can help future generations?
I have learned that we need to look at history so that we know what was good in the past and what can be built upon. We can't totally ignore it. There has to be some reason that those things were made that way and now we're making them this way. And can we make them here better than they can make them overseas?
Mm-hmm.
Cost is a big factor. But you know, now they're beginning to look back at manufacturing in the United States because of, number one, the wages in some of the foreign countries, in China in particular, are going up.
Mm-hmm.
They're looking at the growing cost of shipping on the high seas.
Mm-hmm.
That is going up. And they're beginning to think a little bit about, we need to give Americans jobs.
Yes.
And I think that's very important.
Yes.
And so I'm hoping that we get enough manufacturing back here
Mm-hmm.
that we will be able to get our unemployment down to where it normally is around 3%. It bothers me that, and it bothers many, you know, our young people, back in the days when we had Bethlehem Steel going here, I would like to bet that the generations, 30 or 40% of the young people who lived in Baltimore, especially the males,
Mm-hmm.
in the summertime, worked down at Sparrows Point
That's right.
to earn the revenue that they needed for college
Right.
and to learn how to do things.
Mm-hmm.
And it was a tremendous employment center
Mm-hmm.
and a tremendous benefit to the whole area. And it's been very sad to me that America's steel industry, almost everywhere, is disappearing.
Mm-hmm.
God pity us if we ever get into a war, because we will not be able to produce. Do you know, in World War II, 609 ocean-going ships were built here in Baltimore in those,
That's right.
that 4-year period.
That's right.
609, that's tremendous.
Mm-hmm.
That was more than any other seaport,
Mm-hmm.
what we did here. They were Liberty ships, they were Victory ships, and they were T2 tankers. And we did tremendous amount of repair work
Mm-hmm.
at the Key Highway Shipyard and at Maryland Shipbuilding and Dry Dock Company. We employed, in the steel industry alone, we employed over 50,000 people.
Wow.
Those days. In the airplane industry, and Martin's had located here then
That's right.
because of the steel industry. There were 50,000 there. And in the shipbuilding and repair industry, you had another 50,000.
Mm-hmm.
Those were jobs, and good paying jobs. Things are different, as I said earlier, but we need to think about how we can have people working here. I had in my office at one time a statement up on the framed. I buy American so others can also buy. What that says is,
Beautiful.
I'm buying American so I can keep Americans working so they can buy. And people need to understand that.
So Helen, what do you see for the future?
Well, you know, there's something special in the air right now that I have to stop and ask myself, is this really going to happen? And it's called 3D printing. And I learned about this at a meeting of the Baltimore Council of Foreign Affairs. And one of the gentlemen there was an executive with Maersk Shipping Line. And I was so impressed, I had him come in and meet with the executive director of the Port of Baltimore. Because what it is, they say, I can send a photograph or an image, or however they do it by technology, from China to the U.S., not send the product,
Mm-hmm.
but then the product will be produced in the U.S.
Wow.
Now,
Wow.
that is a challenge, but it's very real. The Wall Street Journal has had several articles on that in the last 3 months.
Mm-hmm.
I've been intrigued by them as I've read them. And if that happens, as the container ship changed the world,
Mm-hmm.
in production and revolutionized the whole world of shipping. 3D printing could again revolutionize the whole shipping industry. And what'll be hit the hardest, in my opinion, strictly, will be the container ships.
Mm-hmm.
Because they're the ones that carry the manufactured goods. Raw materials will still have to be transported, etc. So you're going to have bulk shipping. But I'm wondering, I hope I'm here when 3D printing really becomes active. Just see what a tremendous world the change has brought. I mean, when I started around the Baltimore waterfront, we had 6,500 ships a year come in here. And they were the Liberties and the Victories and the 20,000 tonners and that. Today we have 2,000 some. But one of those ships carries the equivalent of about 5 or 6 Liberty ships.
Okay.
Or more. I mean, a coal ship goes out of here, when it loads up, it goes out of here with anywhere from 60,000 to 100,000 tons of coal. It's a lot of coal in one ship. And that's the way it's changed. So if 3D printing gets going,
oh my,
God knows what's going to happen. And I want you and me to be here to see it.
I want to see it too. Matter of fact, what was your favorite segment of Port That Built the City?
Well, let me see. I probably enjoyed the live shows. We did our first live show, actually the first live show that WMAR did was on a ship that had been battered in a ferocious storm on the high seas, the Steel Ore, and it limped back to Baltimore, made it here safely, and they were able to discharge the cargo. We did a live shot. The whole show was live from that ship.
Wow.
And that was an exciting time because it was really innovative then. I love that your show, that you're thinking about Baltimore so much, John, and you remember how you grew up and the impressions that it made on you.
Yes.
And that's what we want with the youngsters coming along now, that they have that same feeling that you have for Baltimore and to help.
We have that same feeling for you. Like I said, you're one of my childhood memories from early television. 3 channels, folks. Channel 2, Channel 11, and Channel 13. And I remember the Port That Built the City. Host, producer, person who got the advertising dollars in, the person who sat in the cutting room and cut the edit the film, that person, Helen Delich Bentley.
Had a lot of fun.
A lot of fun. Well, I want to thank you for being a part of Eye on Baltimore. And this is John Carrington saying goodbye, but keep your eye on Baltimore.
But there always have been exceptional women who have not had their due. I want to talk about women, the average woman who played a role in history, and that is military history. The women who served, I wrote my book calling them the forgotten heroines. They were, and they still are. And I want to tell you how I came to this. Because I had been working for a men's veterans organization for a number of years. And I knew there were women out there who had served. Because I was in World War II in college, and when I graduated, I was in defense industry, and I knew that some of my classmates had joined something called the WAC, but that's where it left off. Anyway, by chance I was in this position, and in 1977, the National Academy of Medicine did a study of the VA medical system, particularly the hospital system. And they put out, as government agencies do, a big report. And in the preface, it said that this study will not include women. Well, I'm a nosy kind of person, so I said, why won't it include women? And the answer is, there weren't enough of them. So I started to ask questions around to find out who were these women and how many were there. Well, not surprisingly, nobody seemed to know. But eventually we were able to put together that there were over 1 million living women veterans. And this group was not considered important enough to be considered. So we have Miss Carroll, who did enormous things, and then we have the military women. And I want to go back a little bit in the history of military women in this country, because they do go back a long way. Not necessarily as part of the formal military establishment, but as volunteers. And that, I think, is the story of women. Women are volunteers, and have been, and continue to be. And many of them are right here in this room. Anyway, they took volunteer roles with Washington's Army. They were not many, but they were called Women of the Army. They were not in the Army, but they did a lot of the chores that the Army required. They were in all the wars since then. It wasn't until actually the 20th century where women were formally included in the military forces of this country. And we can look at World War I, when generals in the field asked that women be included in the force. Why? Because they needed the men to go elsewhere. They needed them to fight. And all the support roles were not being filled if they used the men for what they were supposed to be there for. And there was a draft, and these were not volunteers. So the word was put out, and there were women who came and were inducted. They were called the Yeomanettes of World War I. And there were less than 20,000, but they were in uniform, but they were not actually a formal part of the military. They were in the Marines. There was a much smaller group. There were less than 1,000. They were called Marinettes. And these women were not just nurses, but they did telephone operating, filing, all kinds of office work. And when the war was over and the men were released, there had been a draft, the women left until the beginnings of World War II. And that's how I really became interested in why these women volunteered when the word was out that the military was recruiting women into the forces. And as I said, it was not just nurses, although they always were an important part of the military force, but they were women who came voluntarily. And I had the good fortune of being able to interview a number of these women. And that's where I really learned about what women do and how they are not given credit for what they do. So I asked, these were older women. I did the research in the late 70s and the early 80s. And these were the women, I would say, who helped pave the way for the women's movement of the 60s. I asked, why did you join? And I got some very interesting answers. One of them said, I can recall this, she said, well, my brother was called up, of course there was a draft, my brother was called up, he had red blood, and so did I. And I didn't see any reason why I should not go. That was one answer. And then there was another answer that was given to me, saying, I am not going to be Polly by the fire while my brothers and my friends are fighting a war. So what you had then, and by the way, there was a very divided opinion in the War Department, in the Congress, and probably in the general population about whether women should be included in this war effort. Despite that, the women who joined the military, and they were the WACs, and then there was the Marines, and the first units were not formally military. They were auxiliaries, so they never became veterans. They had no benefits and they had no protections. They didn't have any protections whatsoever. And one of the most famous of them, of which there have been several films, were the WASPs. They were the women Air Force pilots who ferried planes from here to England. That was the time of the Battle of Britain, and those planes were urgently needed. They ferried them. They flew the planes with targets so that Air Force pilots could practice on them. And they were about 1,000, there were only about a little over 1,000 of these women. They had to be pilots before they were taken into this a very elite outfit that was at Avenger Field in Texas. And each one of their stories was remarkable. I had the good fortune to go to one of their reunions in the early 80s. And there weren't 1,000 left. There were only maybe about 700 left. But they were as feisty and as interesting and as curious as you can imagine. It was an experience just to be around them. But these were the women that helped the Battle of Britain, because if we had not been able to get the planes over, they could not have been able to protect the homeland. Anyway, this is just a taste of what I got, because I found that wherever I went, I came across these women. And some of them stayed on after the war was over. And by the way, there have been statements made that without the women backing up the men, that the war might have taken a different turn. That's, of course, is conjecture, but that has been said. And by the way, I must mention the women at the home front, because there was I was in college at that time, and there was all of a sudden, there was an enormous evacuation. All the men were gone. They were all, they either volunteered or they were drafted. And so who was going to run the streetcar? Who was going to do all the things that were being done by men? Don't forget, women were not in the workforce at that time. It's not so long ago, it's only 2 generations ago, but they were not. I know my own mother was in the house, as were all the other friends of mine, mothers in the house. So what happens? It's the women who come out and they take over all the civilian necessities to keep a society going. Not only that, but they also ran the factories that built the munitions. Of course, you all know the myth of Rosie the Riveter, except it's not a myth. There were the women in the factories. Anyway, so they had as much part in helping the war effort, so to speak, as the women who went into service, who did all kinds of things. And there were women casualties. There were women, not just nurses, but there were telephone operators and other support groups that were in the battlefields of France and the rest of Europe. And there were casualties. But the interesting thing is that the women never thought of themselves, one, as heroines. They never thought of themselves as playing a major role, really, in the history of the country. And I think that still continues to this day. But to continue, after World War II, the auxiliaries were disbanded, as were the troops demobilized. And what happened? The women had taken men's jobs during the war. The men were demobilized. What did they do? They came back and wanted their jobs back. Now, the GI Bill of Rights was conceived partially to greet that conundrum. This huge flux of over 2 million men coming back home, the survivors, and the women sent back into the kitchen, so to speak. And it's interesting because some of the women wanted to stay on. And by the way, another reason that the women gave me, and this was repeated over and over again, was that I wanted to have an adventure. That was another thought. I wanted to see what the world was like. And the fact that they have not recognized their own potential as much as they really can, that makes it so important to think about this past as well, and that there are forgotten heroines all over our friends, our families, and so on. Thank you.
Thank you.